Thank you. Senator Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think all of us could agree that when a doctor prescribes a needed medication, that cost should not be an insurmountable barrier to the patient using it. Yet, for more than half of the adults in my state, according to a survey, it is a barrier. They're worried about affording the cost of prescription drugs. And in the last year, nearly 1 out of 3 Maine adults reported skipping a dose of medicine, cutting pills in half, or not filling a prescription because of cost. I talked to a young woman with type 1 diabetes who, after she aged out of her parents' insurance, started cutting back on her insulin. She ended up in the emergency room and was gravely ill because of that. She felt she just couldn't afford it and took a very unwise chance. So this is a huge problem. But another aspect of this discussion is that many new medications represent true breakthroughs, disease-modifying therapies, or even cures. And the other part is that literally billions of dollars are invested in developing drugs that end up to not be successful. So I think we have to balance all of these concerns. These new drugs often cost more, but if they have the potential to reduce the number of unnecessary hospitalizations and lead to better patient outcomes, they may be worth it. For disorders like Alzheimer's, the breakthrough drugs can help keep patients healthier and active longer, benefiting society as well as their families. For example, I've heard of a patient being diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment early enough that the patient was able to benefit from a newly available treatment and actually return to the workforce. That's quite an accomplishment. Now, last year, the chairman criticized this particular company for a list price of $26,500 per year, even after the company, in a really unprecedented fashion, issued a lengthy analysis of the process by which they arrived at the price. Still, sticker shock around list prices and speculative claims that certain therapies will bankrupt the Medicare program have contributed to restrictive coverage policies, patient confusion, and limited uptake. So I would like, Mr. Davis, you to discuss how we can balance the need to have affordable medications without hampering innovation, and how access to the next, what would be the impact on access to the next generation of medications if price controls like those in Europe are implemented? How do you see a solution to the balance between affordability and innovation?
Yes. So, Senator, thank you for the question. I would start with, at Merck, and what are the principles we apply when we think about how we price drugs? Because I think it also gets to some of the other questions that have been asked about what stops you from just raising your price. And I can tell you that as a company, and this goes back to the core of who we are over 130 years and is truly the purpose we live by, and that is we look at several elements. We look at what is the benefit to the patient, but equally we do look at what is the benefit or the cost to the system. We look at access and affordability, and I can tell you, for instance, when we launched Keytruda, we launched at parity to market price, even though we knew we had a better product, in part because we wanted to ensure access. And so we look at all of that, and then we look at what does it take to absorb the cost of all the failed drugs. We know 90% of all drugs we will bring into the clinic fail. The reality of it is the drugs that make it have to fund that failure. In the case of Merck, it's just interesting, I think, to point out, since 2014, the minority of drugs we have launched have actually even returned their cost of R&D. The minority. The majority have not returned their cost of R&D. So it means that when you do get the rare drug that succeeds, it has to help cover that. So that's what we're facing in the system. But as we look at how can we fix this, I think we have to get to the out-of-pocket cost, and we have to find a way to really drive that down, and then continue to find ways to bring better access through the types of access programs we've all talked about here, whether it's through patient assistance programs, copay assistance, all of the ways we can help the individual person address that affordability challenge, which we all know someone who's faced that, and I don't want to see anyone face that.
NIH provides a lot of assistance in the research that, and sometimes partners with pharmaceutical companies. How is the fact that there has been federal help, for example, in the development of the COVID vaccines, how does that factor into the pricing?
Well, and obviously, as we look at the system, the ecosystem we live in, it is important to understand that all players are important. So the role of the NIH is important. The NIH basically does the basic research, if you will. They provide the lock, but they don't have the key. We provide the key. We take that basic research, we sculpt it into a molecule. We were able to say, now that we know a target of disease to go after, how do we do it? And then we spend our resources in the most expensive part of the development and the riskiest part, which is the clinical development, to ensure safety and efficacy to bring the drug to market. So we need all players in the ecosystem.
And if I could ask you to start to wrap up for Senator Smith.
It's important that we do that. And so I think as you look in the COVID vaccine situation, we did not receive any federal funding for what we did. We've spent all of our own resources at risk. We commented it was $2.5 billion. We did that at risk. But one of the programs we did do, Lagevrio, did have some basis from the NIH, and they were compensated for that.
On behalf of the chairman, Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all of you for being with us here today. I appreciate it. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Davis. Could you tell us how much Merck spends on advertising every year?
So if you look in the United States, our direct-to-consumer advertising is about $350 million.
And then also direct to medical providers?
I don't have that. I wouldn't know that number. We can come back to you on that one.
Okay. I think it's approximately $2 billion overall is what I think is what worldwide. That's a worldwide number. Pardon me for that.
I don't recognize that number, but we can come back to you.
Okay. Okay. And so, one thing I bet most of us on this panel could agree with is that nobody likes that advertising. Doctors don't like it. Patients don't like it. I know that the American Medical Association has called for a ban on direct-to-consumer advertising. So could you just address this issue? And I think it's also true that you sued to prevent regulations that would require you to disclose the list prices in that advertising. Could you address that?
Yes, I'm happy to do that, Senator. So, direct-to-consumer advertising serves an important purpose. There's been studies that have shown that it drives better adherence. It drives patients to understand the use of their medications, and it overall will bring benefits to the health system. So I do believe there's a valid educational piece to direct-to-consumer advertising, and I also believe we need to be full and fair and transparent in helping people understand the cost of drugs. The reason we brought suit, the one you're referring to, was our concern that the specific request that was in that was that you show the list price of the drug. And our concern, based on all the conversations we've had here this morning, is that that can often be very misleading and, in fact, could cause patients not to seek the drug when, in reality, take Januvia as an example. If we put on an advertisement that it's $6,900, when in reality, if you take the total in the system, it's $690, I would hate to think someone doesn't show up to get that medicine because they don't understand the price. What we supported instead, which is what we do today, in all of our direct-to-consumer advertising, we drive you to a site that gives our list price, it gives all of the rebates we provide so that you can see it, and we give further information and education. We think that is a more effective tool and a more accurate tool to stop the misperceptions that exist. That's why we raised that concern.
One of the things that I think is really confusing for patients is to try to figure out what, how much things cost in the health system overall, including in prescription medications. And so let me just ask you, and I'm going to ask you about this, Dr. Berner. How much would acute myeloid leukemia patient, how much would that patient pay every month for your drug, Adifa, the cancer treatment, that if, let's say, they had a 20% co-insurance responsibility?
Senator, I don't have that exact figure off the top of my head. What I can say is that for most of our oral oncologic drugs, we're able, as on the commercial side, to bring copays down to a very low amount and in many cases to zero. Now, to a point that was raised earlier, we have to do more to make that more widely available and an easier process to actually get into those programs, and we're working on that. We've been doing that since I became CEO in November, and that's something we're committed to. And again, I'd like to be able to provide that same benefit on the Medicare side.
So, but if you have a list price that is, and I get what you all are saying about the list price is just the list price, that isn't necessarily what people pay, but if you have a list price and then you have a co-insurance responsibility that's a percentage of the list price, that could still be quite a significant amount of money. I mean, I think it could be, in this case, $6,800 a month for this medication.
Senator, what you're pointing out is absolutely why we believe we've got to also look at ways to bring that list price down. We've been discussing at length this sort of the complexity and the intermediaries play in this system that lead to incentives to drive those list prices up. But unquestionably, because out-of-pocket costs and co-insurance, for example, are typically tied to that list price, we have to find ways to bring that list price down.
Well, I would agree with that. I think that is a really significant issue, particularly as I think some of my colleagues have pointed out that when you get to these patient assistance programs, they're quite confusing and hard to navigate through. And I think that sometimes that's only available if you have commercial insurance, and if you don't have commercial insurance, then you could really be flat out of luck.
Senator, that's correct. And in fact, I referenced that since I became CEO, one of the things we've done on the commercial side is really begun to look at how many hoops do patients have to go through to get access to these copay support programs. We've provided $2.5 billion in copay support programs over the last 5 years as a company, provided $12 billion in free product. But we've got to make it easier and more universally available for commercial patients to get access to that. Again, there are some constraints to us being able to provide those services on the Medicare side. There's some very legitimate concerns to providing those on the Medicare side because you don't want to obviously be diverting patients from, for example, generic products onto these as a result of onto branded products as a result of this. But we would love to work with members of Congress to find ways to do this constructively.
And is it true that the cost of those patient assistance programs you can then turn around and deduct on your taxes to lower your tax liability?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that, but I can follow up.
Okay. I want to get at the question. I just have a minute left, and so let me see if I can do this really quickly. One of the challenges that we have are some often pretty severe shortages in medications. And I have heard so many stories about this from Minnesota folks who they have a preferred treatment for a disease and then the drug is not available. So I want to ask you all, I'll cut to the chase on this. Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski and I have a piece of legislation that would require reporting of supply chain disruptions that could lead to shortages in medications. And I'd like to know whether you all would support that concept to help people understand where these shortages are and where the root chemicals for their medications are coming from.
We work very closely with the Drug Shortage Office at the FDA, and we're constantly doing all efforts to dual source the entire supply chain of our medicines so there's no discontinuations in our supply.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with the specifics of the bill, but I would say in general, the more we can continue to help understand what are the shortage issues, we should address that. But I think we got to get at the fundamental issues of why do we have a shortage in the first place. I can tell you in our example, we make a drug called Tyspes.
And again,
Okay,
you're
sorry.
over time, so could
Sorry.
you take those answers for the record,
I
Senator
would be
Smith?
happy to, Senator Kane.
Great. On behalf of the chair, Senator Braun.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. Davis. What would your definition of a free market be?
One where you are able to bring goods, and if those goods bring value and the system sees value in them, you're able to bring those at a value you think is fair and reasonable and negotiate with the other sides in a world where you have free competition.
So right there you said negotiate. Most free markets are typified by this. And I'd like you all to listen to this because I think the big challenge, if I were in your seat running your companies, is that it's not a free market. A free market means you've got a lot of choices, you've got vibrant competition, no barriers to entry, and you've got an engaged consumer. Now, do any of those apply to your business?
I think all of those apply, but I think one thing we need to understand in the way our business functions, for a period of time, we have exclusivity. That's during the patent protection period. Thereafter, and in that period, we must reap a return on the investments we make to fund the R&D we do. Thereafter, drugs are freely available, and there is total competition in that space.
But yet you would sue to keep transparency in terms of what the consumer price would be or the list price. Or you do things like tweak patents. That doesn't happen anywhere else. And you're not alone there. Hospitals and insurance companies do all this stuff behind closed doors as well. So I would think if I were in your shoes, you've got maybe a few years before, so none of that stuff really applies to you guys as I listed it. You might try to spin it that way, but it's not the case. I fixed it in my own business back in, probably 15, 16 years ago by creating healthcare consumers, by trying to avoid the system through wellness and prevention, which you don't hear much about. But when you do need it, it's got to be to where you've got a lot of options. And I understand you're a little different in terms of the R&D that goes into it. And then many years ago, you created a monster called the PBM that now is sucking all kinds of money out of the market. Why can't you fix that in terms of doing alternative ways that would just smother the market with transparency and get it into a different channel of distribution? You got a guy like Mark Cuban that's trying to start a company at cost plus. You're going to probably need to find things like that, or you're going to be appearing more often here, and it's going to be where you're going to be regulated like a utility would be. Because in my opinion, you operate more like an unregulated utility, kind of cloak yourselves behind free enterprise, and now it's up to 18, 19% of our GDP. Something's got to give. Senator Sanders talked earlier about things costing 10% to 25% overseas, and I think I heard the excuse was, well, they have price controls. Well, I think I'd be smart enough to know that sooner or later that will occur here. It's going to be up to the industry to fix it, and you're probably just 15 to 20% of the problem. You could fix the part that you get the most heat for by maybe trying to get more customers like the business Mark Cuban is putting out there that's based upon transparency. If not, you're going to get all the people that don't own healthcare businesses finally saying we're not going to pay through the private side, the insurance system, 3 to 4 times what it costs through government. And I'll let you complete the logical chain. You're going to have government as your business partner. So why would you persist in a paradigm that looks like you're going to be headed towards what you definitely don't want, and that's doing more business with the federal government? Mr. Davis.
Well, I don't want to speculate on the systems as a whole. I think what I focus on is what do we need to do to drive the mission of our company, which is in the near term, bring access and affordability, make sure that when we bring affordability, we don't sacrifice access, and often patients lose access when we try to address affordability, and that we fund innovation. And that's whatever ultimately we come to as a solution. If we can protect those elements, I think we will both help patients of today, and we can make the investments.
Have you ever looked at
in the
having
future.
some other system of distribution like almost any other manufacturer would have when you make something? You do a pretty good job making the pill. You completely default on how it gets from where you make it to who uses it. You're putting independent pharmacies out of business because of PBMs and other kind of peculiarities in the industry. Have you thought about at least in the place where most people confront the healthcare system with a prescription about trying to restructure that, smother it with transparency and options to where people can get their stuff, and then apply that to biologics and the entirety of the spectrum, and don't tweak the patents and try to preserve a broken system?
Yeah, so, we have considered, should we look at going direct? The reality of it is, as a single company, when you have now today 3 PBMs controlling 80% of the lives in this country, the ability to do that takes a portfolio of characteristics that we don't currently have, and I don't believe any one company can do that. That's why we continue to believe we need free market, but we
I'll
do
bet if
need
you
to work
collectively got together with the other drug companies and encouraged others like a Cost Plus that Mark Cuban has done, to where you're going, I think you've got it under your control not to perpetuate a bad situation that was created by you. I mean, you make it. You don't have to necessarily use PBMs. Why don't you encourage an alternative structure? At least show us that you're wanting to compete. Because all I can tell you is that if you don't take the bull by the horns, do something different, you're going to be like all other countries. You're going to be dealing with the federal government as a regulated entity, and I think we could lose some things. But in the meantime, Senator Sanders pointed it out. It costs a lot more here. The healthcare outcomes are better there, and pharma, hospitals, and insurance better figure it out before it's too late.